Palestinians and the Israelis are very, very closely related to each other. An acquaintance who I had met in March, an Israeli woman, her son was in one of those military bases that was one of the first ones that was taken over by the Hamas fighters, and he was killed at 20 years old.
Welcome to the Impact Nations podcast. My name is Tim. I am your host. And today we're doing something a little different, actually. We are revisiting an episode that was just 2 episodes ago. You may recall episode 586. I've already lost track. I should have checked. Sorry. We had Mercy Aiken with us. She's an author and is the grand poobah of the network of evangelicals for the Middle East, and that interview was recorded actually several weeks before it aired. And it turns out, just the way the timing worked for the release of our episodes, that episode actually came out just after the current war in Israel and Gaza had started. And so I reached out to Mercy just right after that and said, would you be willing to come back and have a further conversation in light of current events? Mercy has graciously agreed, and so we're going to squeeze it in right here because all of this stuff is unfolding before us. So Mercy, thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
I've been getting a lot of great feedback on our conversation that we had earlier. And so by the way, if you're watching this and you haven't seen that episode yet, go back and check it out. I think we called it The Fifth Gospel. It is an interview specifically about Mercy's book that really is helpful. So go listen to that. I'm going to do my best not to retread a lot of that stuff. I want to talk today, Mercy, about this current situation that Israel and Hamas find themselves in Gaza, and just try to, look at it with compassion, with empathy, but gain an understanding. I think you've got some perspective that many of us need. And so I thought, let's just start having a conversation and see where it goes. You cool with that if we just go down some rabbit trails?
Yeah, we'll just roll with it and see what the Lord brings out.
You know what? Actually, I know you and I were just talking off air just a moment ago. You've got your ear to the ground. You've got a lot of friends and colleagues and stuff in the region. Can you maybe just share with us a little bit about what you're hearing, people's experiences on the ground or rumors and things like that maybe we're not hearing about in the news?
Would you like to hear, I have some personal stories of friends of mine who have lost loved ones. Obviously there's the political situation on the ground. There might be some inside things I could share there. So, where would you like me to start?
Yeah, why don't we hear about some of your friends, people that you know personally who have lost loved ones, and just share some of their stories if you would, because I think that's going to help us keep rooted and grounded. Because much of this is political talk in terms of these are two nations at war, and yet we must never forget. I just saw headlines again. The death toll in Gaza is now they're estimating over 5,000, more than 2,000 children. It's easy sometimes to rattle off those statistics, be horrified by them, but not grounded. And so I think just hearing some personal stories may ground us a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, when I first heard about what was happening, that Hamas had busted out of, how they did this is still very astounding, but that they managed to get out of Gaza and get into Israel and begin taking hostages and killing people in the military bases and kibbutzim around the area. I just immediately began to write a lot of my Israeli friends and my Palestinian friends, because I knew that everybody was, going to be very tense. And I just wanted them to know, I'm thinking about you. I'm praying for you. How are you doing? Mm-hmm. And an acquaintance who I had met in March, an Israeli woman who had invited me to go with her to one of the protests that have been going on every weekend this entire year in Israel up until this war broke out, protesting the new government. She's an American Jew who lives in Israel, and she just wrote back one short sentence: "My son was killed." And I remembered her telling me about her son when we spent the evening together in March. And she said, he's 20 years old. He's in the IDF right now. And I'm worried about him. Like, this is not a tenable situation. And she was one of the people who would be more of an activist working for a just peace in the land. And so her son was in one of those military bases that was one of the first ones that was taken over by the Hamas fighters. And he was killed at 20 years old. So her oldest child. So that immediately just went right to my heart. I haven't even shared about it publicly because it's her story. And then a few days later, or maybe a week later, I've kind of lost track of the time. I was sharing a lot about the Christians who were sheltering at the St. Porphyrius Orthodox Church in Gaza. And on my social media, I've been sharing photos and showing these people that have been huddled in the church, receiving communion and praying and just hoping that they would be spared there. And of course, that church was hit, a side of it, not the church itself, but like part of the church campus, where there were people who were sheltering in one of the rooms. And one of my friends, her aunt was killed in that. One of my friends who lives in Bethlehem, I should say. So their family is separated. Her mother is named Noha. Noha is from Gaza, and she married a Palestinian who lives in Bethlehem. So she's spent her life in Bethlehem, separated from her relatives in Gaza, and because of the situation, you have to get multiple permissions from Israel to be able even to go. So she's only seen her family like once in a blue moon, when either she gets permission to go to Gaza or they get permission to come out. And her sister was, one of the people sheltering in that church who was killed, along with some other relatives who are very wounded. And I would just like to remind people who are listening to this that there is a Christian community in Gaza.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of Muslims who do not support Hamas in Gaza. Gaza is not a monolith of Hamas fighters by any means. Hamas never even, if I understand correctly, did not even win with a majority. And certainly a lot of the people who are dying in Gaza today were born way after Hamas has been in power. They have nothing to do with it. So just hearing a lot of these stories from my friends on both sides, then I continued to hear from Israeli friends who, one of these kibbutz, at least one of them, seems to have been peopled with a lot of peace activists, Israeli peace activists. And so a lot of these were ones who were killed and some of them taken hostage in Gaza. So a lot of my friends who are Israeli peace activists are very much grieving because these are like their partners, who were murdered and who are in Gaza and may already have died under Israeli bombing or whatever. Like, they don't know if they're ever going to see even the hostages again. And then I'm continuing to also hear stories from my friends in the occupied territories about relatives in Gaza, and also a lot of violence, an uptick of violence that has happened throughout the West Bank, with settlers kind of going on rampages now. I think there's been like maybe 90 Palestinians killed since this thing began in the West Bank, and that is not making the news.
And can you talk to us a little bit about that? I read your book, and so when you say settlers, I pretty quickly grasp that, but I'm not sure that we talked too much about that last time we were speaking. Just describe for us what that might look like when you say a settler,
Yeah. Okay. That's the occupied Palestinian territories is like the official name, I think, under the UN, of land that Israel has been controlling since 1967, when it began to occupy this land. And it is the area of land that was always hoped, when people talked about a two-state solution, where a Palestinian state would be. But there have been many Israelis moving over from Israel, and also Jews immigrating from other parts of the world, including the United States, to live in these Jewish-only communities that are being built all over the West Bank, in the place that, was determined this will be a state for Palestinians, taking land and resources, water, not just the settlements, but also building roads that are exclusive for Israelis, building military bases, lots of internal checkpoints within the West Bank, not Palestinians wanting to go into Israel proper, but just travel around in the West Bank. All of these things are part of this apparatus of control in the West Bank designed to keep the Israeli settlers safe in these communities that they're building in Palestinian territory. For a lot of Israelis, it's just a cheaper neighborhood to live in. Israel gives tax benefits to people who move into these neighborhoods and house.
So they're incentivizing people.
Oh, it's incentivized for sure.
Isn't theirs to begin with?
Yes, very much incentivized. It's way more expensive if on a matter of principle. Like I have my friend Ori, an Israeli, who refuses as a matter of principle to live anywhere outside of the Green Line, the originally kind of recognized border, so to speak. But housing is way more expensive. And that's like a costly choice that he has made as a matter of principle. So a lot of the settlers, I will say, they are just Israelis who are like, it's cheaper to live over here. They don't really think about it much in ideological terms, except maybe in a broad stroke, like this is all our land or something like that. But there are some settlers who are very ideological, very, very committed to this idea that we have to take all of this land. We have to kick out the Palestinians. Bezalel Smotrich, who is in the Israeli government, I forget exactly what position he has. I'm not going to misquote it, but he's part of this new Netanyahu coalition. He's one of these right-wing settlers. And he said a few years ago, these are the choices that we want Palestinians to have: either accept basically like a second-class status, living as a Palestinian in a Jewish state, or leave, or basically you may end up dead if you don't take one or, yeah. These ideological settlers have been going on killing rampages all year long, which is why before we had our Nimi Fall retreat, which we just did, we were trying to figure out what to title it. And we kindly came up with the title Crisis in the Holy Land. What can we do? Because this place was in crisis before this crisis sort of presented itself in front of the world as a crisis that you cannot look away from anymore. It was already a crisis before that. In the terms that the Israelis themselves use, they performed pogroms on several different Palestinian towns this year, Huwara and Jenin in particular, where the settlers went on rampages, burning cars and houses and killing people and saying, wipe Huwara off the face of the earth. There's been a lot of tensions that have been rising. More Palestinians prior to this war have been killed this year than any other year since the Second Intifada. And last year was the highest year before that. And
this stuff's been going on, and none of it was reported. We haven't heard about anything of like that in the news until, of course, recent events brought everything to the fore.
Right. I think this stuff has been reported, but just not enough, and a lot of people just really aren't paying attention. So it's been a year. The past 2 years have been really full of tension. And when I say crisis in the Holy Land, I'm also talking about on the Israeli side, because people have been protesting every weekend after weekend for this entire year, worried about some of the changes that the extremist government is bringing to the balance of power with the Supreme Court and the executive branch and so on. So it's been at crisis point. And now we're just seeing more of a full-fledged vision of it.
A couple questions. I'm going to try and keep them sorted in my mind here, but you mentioned hard extremist governments. We have extremist governments, and I'm going to use government loosely with Hamas, but on both sides of this issue right now. Hamas has rule of some kind in Gaza. You mentioned earlier, which was news to me, and I want to touch on it a little bit more, just the fact that you don't even believe that they had majority of votes in order to gain power. Once they gained power, they've not let it go. Can you just give us perhaps a little bit of the political history of Hamas, where they, how they got into control and what they want?
Hamas was, this is my understanding, Hamas is a reactionary movement. It wasn't like Israel has been battling Hamas from its infancy. Hamas began to come along in the 80s.
Mhm.
And they were a reactionary movement against the corrupt government of the PLO, that was like funneling a lot of money for themselves and not really representing what Hamas felt needed to be represented for the Palestinian people, both in terms of taking care of the population and in terms of resisting the ongoing chipping away of Palestine for Palestinians to live in. Now, this is from a Palestinian perspective, of course. So there's two wings of it. There is the social wing, and then there is the militant wing. The social wing does hospitals, all kinds of things that are genuinely helpful and needed within the community. And then the militant wing, Hamas would say of itself that Israelis have an army. We can have an army too. And so they are obviously very conservative. Their charter originally said, they wanted to wipe Israel completely off, like it did not have a right to exist. This whole land is Palestine, and we're going to take it back. In a later charter, they did modify that language some and say that there would be a willingness to discuss just having a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. Mm-hmm. I do know people, like I mentioned in Bashara's book, like Brother Andrew and Bashara and other Christian workers from overseas and locals who did a lot of work. And I know Israelis who have also done the same. There are very reasonable, there are people that you can talk to within Hamas, like this whole sort of dehumanizing caricature of them as though they're just these bloodthirsty monsters who want nothing more than to kill every single Jew, I don't think is accurate. But they definitely are a problem. They're what they have done, in my view, is set back the just cause of the Palestinian people by inflicting these acts of violence on innocent Israelis who were just living in their homes. There's a lot more I could say about this. You can ask me more questions if you want.
Well, is there a movement within Gaza to remove them from power, or are they just too? Is it kind of like what happens in Afghanistan, where they've got too much control, they're too frightening, they're too scary, and so even though people would rather not live under their rule, they're just too afraid to do anything about it?
I know there are other political parties. They have not been able to gain traction. The Palestinians themselves, even in the West Bank, they've not had an election in like 18 years or something. Mahmoud Abbas has been in power forever. So there is definitely some stagnation there in terms of on the ground people who are actively opposing Hamas. I know there are other political parties there. There's even other Muslim militant parties like Islamic Jihad and others. So I feel answering more in depth on the political aspect of that would be beyond my capability. I would just be sort of giving my opinion.
Yeah. Have you been to Gaza?
I've not been to Gaza. Gaza is almost impossible to get into.
Yeah. It's a pretty tight spot. I think many of us have seen kind of maps overlaid with places that we're familiar with just to get a sense of scale and stuff. And it is not a large territory. It seems odd to me that Palestinian territory is divided into these two districts. You've got West Bank and you've got Gaza. How did that happen? How is it that they're not contiguous?
Well, I think part of the way that the Israelis have managed to maintain this control over this land is by trying to divide and fragment the Palestinian population. So that has been happening within Israel proper. That happens in the West Bank, and separating Gaza from the West Bank and like making them inaccessible for Palestinians one to the other. That is part of the Israeli control. In fact, at the beginning, and this is not a conspiracy, this is like known, Israel originally helped to kind of support Hamas in the beginning because it was a counterbalance to the other Palestinian parties, and it would help to kind of fragment and divide the society. And it's even known that like Netanyahu has aided somehow, like the money coming to Hamas through Qatar, the Netanyahu administration allowed that to happen. So there's just layers of complexity to this whole thing. Yeah. is my point with it. But in short, it's divide and conquer, it's separate. So even in the West Bank, like part of the settlement strategy is to like separate the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank by taking there's this really hotly contested chunk of land that the settlers are trying to take, which will then isolate the northern West Bank from the southern West Bank. It's already the Palestinian areas where they have any sort of authority at all. And I would kind of say that in quotes because it's very limited. Those are just little islands that are disconnected from each other. So the land is physically divided. The land is also divided intentionally politically. It's divided by having an array of informers, basically, like young men who would be arrested by the Israelis, often return out of prison, coming back as informers, because whatever they experienced in prison either scared them or convinced them somehow that they needed to take on this role. So they often also is basically like a network of spies, Palestinians spying on each other under the control of the Israeli apparatus to keep the West Bank safe for settlers.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yep, it does. Last time we talked, Mercy, we talked a lot about, you gave us some really helpful understanding eschatologically, kind of gave us kind of the perhaps more traditional evangelical understanding of Israel, and kind of gave us an alternative point of view. And so again, if that's stuff that interests you, I really would encourage you to go back and listen to that episode if you haven't, or re-listen to it. By the way, hot tip, I re-listened to it today, partly just so we wouldn't rehash some of the stuff we talked about just 2 weeks ago. And that episode can be listened to at double speed, no problem. I was able to listen to the whole thing in about 27 minutes. So nice. You do it. We won't offend either one of us. It's just really good material. So please listen to that. But that's eschatological. That's, looking to end times, looking to the future. If we could today, I want to look back a little bit just at the history of this land in terms of who has lived there, because it is admittedly confusing. It has changed hands many times, but there's the political authority over the region, or the political nations that may have occupied that territory, but there's also just the people groups that have been there. Israel as a nation, the nation that we know of today, was established in 1948. You've mentioned the dates 1967 today in terms of the division of Palestinian territories. Maybe it's too big of a question because we got a lot of history here, but can you walk us through a little bit about who are the people groups that have been there? Ultimately, the question is, who has the right to be there? And again, we're not going to solve Middle East peace today as we talk, but if you could just give us some more information, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners, even just as they pray.
All right, I'm going to tell you the way I look at this.
Sure.
Well, I'll start. Obviously, there were Canaanite, there were these ancient tribes that were there prior to the ancient Hebrews coming in and establishing the kingdom of Israel in its ancient state. I read just an article in Haaretz just recently that talked about they have found like some of the bones and stuff, fragments from these ancient Canaanites, and they've been able to do some of these DNA studies that apparently show that about half of the Israeli DNA and Palestinian DNA both come from the ancient Canaanites, which is interesting. So then there was the Israeli kingdom. I mean, you also have to know, like, even when you read the Bible, this was never like some pure bloodline or something, as some people in a very racist way tend to look at it. I mean, when we look at the lineage of Jesus, we see all the women, or most of the women that are listed in his lineage, were not actually Jewish. There was Ruth from Moab, there was Rahab, there were these other so this is what Israel was. It was like a community of faith that people could join.
Yeah.
It was always like something of a melting pot, is the point that I want to say. There was the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt with the Hebrew people, for example. It's always been something of a melting pot, and it still is something of a melting pot. If you go to Israel today, you will see in Israel, Ethiopian Jews, you'll see Jews from India, you'll see North African, you'll see white European looking. There's all different types, and the same is true with the Palestinians. So at this piece of land that is sort of at the crossroads of the world, Europe, Africa, and Asia, it's right there. And so this land has been controlled by many different kingdoms and armies all through history who have wanted it for strategic reasons. Sorry about this light shining here. I'll try to
You're good.
rid of that a little bit. Through the history, there's just layers and layers and layers. And if you go and you go to any of the historic sites, you'll see that even after AD 70 and then AD, I think 138 or whatever, when the last of the Jews were being kicked out of the land, there have been many kingdoms that have come and gone, including the European Crusader kingdoms, the Byzantine kingdoms. There have been the Mamluk kingdoms from Egypt. There were the Arab, so there's all these different layers culminating with not culminating, but then you have the Ottoman kingdom that was over the entire Levant, which was the Turkish people. And then you have the British Mandate. So when I look at Palestinians, they are like a composite of all of these different peoples who have ever lived in the Holy Land. And most of them, if their DNA is tested, you'll see that they are like Greek, they're Arab, they are North African, they might be Spanish or, French from some Crusader. They might be part Jewish, like they will show all of these different things in their composite. They're just the people of the land who've lived in the land with these, just like in England, like one invading army after another. And it just creates like this mix of genetic material. But the Palestinians, as I said at the beginning, the Palestinians and the Israelis are very, very closely related to each other. And if anyone wants to follow that up, they can. And just a point I want to make about that is I see a lot of my Christian brothers and sisters posting about God's covenantal faithfulness to Jews. And I'm happy to hear them talk about this, but I would ask them to consider if what that covenantal faithfulness to Jews, like what that is based on. How is God looking at saying, well, you're part of this Jewish line, therefore I'm covenantally faithful to you. Where does God say you're in and you're out with that when you're talking about people who are descended from ancient Israelites? So I feel like it could be a real game changer if Christians, if those who want to make a big deal about that, and we could get into a theological discussion whether, that's appropriate or not, but if you want to make a big deal about that, if they would also include Palestinians in that as one of the groups that are descended from ancient Israelites and include them then in God's covenantal faithfulness, I think that could be a game changer in the way that people think about Israel and Palestine, in the way they pray for it, in the way that they intercede and care for all of the people who are there. If their main point is God has special care for the ancient covenantal people of Israel and their descendants to, thousands of generations, then they have to include Palestinians in that as well, if that's the point.
That's a helpful perspective for sure. And I'm going to avoid the temptation to go down the whole rabbit hole of, I'm just not going to do it today. But let's talk a little bit about how you're engaging with people, because you're seeing stuff. I'm sure you're seeing stuff on social media from your Christian brothers and sisters, from news outlets, things like that, where perhaps you're pulling your hair out. I can't do that anymore, but where you're frustrated because they're missing a crucial piece of understanding or something. Is there something that you find yourself regularly wishing people understood? I think you just told us one of them, but
Yeah, I really do think that latter point is one that I feel like I need to take some time and really explore this and write it up, because I do think it would be very helpful for some people. But another is that a lot of people act historically almost as though this whole thing started on October 7th,
yeah.
when the Hamas terrorists began killing the Israelis in the kibbutz. And it's frankly, you can't pick that as your starting point. I think people really need to understand that there is a genuine issue of injustice that is ongoing, and it is systematic, and it is not small. It is a well-functioning machine that Palestinians have been living under for decades now. And until this issue is really righteously resolved, this is going to continue to go on.
The danger of talking about that, Mercy, because I actually was engaged in some good conversation this weekend about some of this stuff, that it's really important that we say, as a caveat or whatever, we need to face the reality that what happened on October 7th was awful, and it was horrendous. It grieved God. It should grieve all of humanity. What
That's
has
right.
happened since October 7th should also grieve humanity, and I'm sure is grieving the Lord every single minute of every single day, as more and more of his creatures are being caught up and destroyed in the midst of it. But I think it's okay. I think it's important that we do talk about what led up to October 7th. And it's not about making excuses for Hamas.
Absolutely not.
But at the same time, there is such a thing as cause and effect. I mean, if you behave a certain way for long enough towards someone or a people group, there will be a response of some kind. Again, that does not forgive or excuse the response in any way. But you're telling us that we need to step back and look at the systematic injustice that's been happening in that region to the people of Gaza specifically, because you mentioned Gaza. It sounds much worse in terms of the type of oppression that they're living under there.
Yeah.
And we don't know. That story isn't told outside of Gaza, is it?
Right. I mean, the people of Gaza cannot leave. I mean, it's very hard for them to leave. They are separated from their families and loved ones that live in other parts of Palestine. They cannot see each other. They've been living on already, I think, like 90 some odd percent of the water, for example, in Gaza is not drinkable, because in one of the previous wars, the Israelis bombed their water treatment plant and the desalination or whatever they were doing there to provide more drinking water. They have very few hours of electricity every day, and they never knew when it would come on, sometimes in the middle of the night. Oh, you suddenly have electricity. You've got to get up at 2 a.m. and do your laundry and go online and write whatever it was you were going to do on social media or whatever. The life has been so irregular and unlivable for the Gazans for 16 years, ever since this blockade went up.
Yeah.
One of the Israeli ministers said, we won't starve Gaza, we'll put them on a diet, which means that just a certain amount of calories, for example, are legally allowed in. There are humanitarian many Gazans therefore require humanitarian assistance just to live. They can't export a lot of the stuff that they have. They can't import a lot of the stuff they have. They're in a bind. It's not that they don't have the creativity or they don't live in a place where they could flourish. Everything about their borders are controlled. They can only fish a few miles off of the coast. If they go farther, there are Israeli sniper boats. They used to have an airport. It was bombed. So I remember in 2014, when I started following this situation, the UN said Gaza will be unlivable by 2020. So it's already past that mark. And a child who, I don't know, a teenager has already lived through how many bombings, of Gaza during their lifetime. Psychologists and people I know who do work over there talk about the fact that most Gazans there are deeply traumatized now. There's a mental health crisis. They need counseling. They need they're all suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. So those were some of the conditions. And I should also add that like 75% of the people that live in Gaza are descended from refugees, Palestinian refugees who were forced out from places like Jaffa and Haifa and other places that are today in Israel proper. And they went down the coast to Gaza just to retreat, planning to come back to their homes, as international law has made very clear. When people flee from their home during a wartime, they're allowed to come back. They have not been allowed to come back. So there's a lot of factors that have contributed to the rise of the kind of extremism that we see in Gaza today. I think I took that off on a there's just layers of Palestinian experience. Like a Palestinian who is a citizen of Israel. These were people who were not driven out in 1948, so their descendants remained in the land, and eventually they were given Israeli citizenship, I think in 1966. They have the best life out of all of the Palestinians. The ones who lived in what is today the West Bank or East Jerusalem are now living under the occupation. Well, East Jerusalem is its own specific situation. These people live in Jerusalem, but they are not given citizenship in Israel. They pay taxes, but they're not citizens. They have like a temporary permit that they have to renew from year to year for the right to live in Jerusalem. They're treated basically as like a foreigner. And there's all kinds of rules, like they can't marry someone from the West Bank. If they fall in love with someone who lives a few miles away in Bethlehem, that person is not allowed to move to Jerusalem and live with them. They have to leave Jerusalem.
Because the Israelis don't want them adding to their numbers.
They don't want more Palestinians within Israel proper. And there's more I could say on that. I'm just trying to give a sort of a brief overview, but those people still have it better than the people that live in the occupied West Bank, because they do live in Israel proper. Therefore, they have more freedom to travel. Then there are the ones that live in the West Bank, who live under the occupation in a different way. And it depends on where you live in the West Bank, what type of experience you're going to have. But if you happen to be an unfortunate little community that lives next door to where a settlement crops up, your life is going to be way worse than someone who lives just right in Bethlehem. Or if you're someone who lives in a refugee camp in the occupied territories, your life is going to be a lot harder.
Yeah.
Then you have the people that live in Gaza who have it the worst of all.
We talked about this a few weeks ago, but it bears repeating. What you have just described sounds so familiar. If you've read carefully the New Testament, if you've read the Gospels, if you understand the communities that Jesus was preaching and the people he was preaching to, an occupied people as the Romans occupied this land, and the Jews were experiencing that exact thing in first century Palestine. And in fact, even I know because our friend Brian, a friend of ours and yours, talked to us here on this podcast a year or two ago, teaching us about the war of AD 70 and how there was a complete lockdown of Jerusalem, and they basically they tried to starve them out. The Romans wouldn't let any food in, and those who tried to leave were gutted, and I mean just atrocities. And yet what's happening in Gaza right now this month sure looks awfully familiar from nearly 2,000 years ago. So I don't know, make of that what you will. And we talked about that on the last episode, but just more of what you just said again just reminds me, like, oh man, yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, it's true. The patterns, you just see them over and over again. But one thing I just wanted to add is you don't see Palestinian citizens of Israel who live up in Haifa, where there's a lot of coexistence groups and people that throw frisbees together, whatever. You don't see them doing the kind of things you see Palestinians who might be their own cousins, doing down in Gaza.
Because their experience day to day is
their experience is different. And that's the main point that I want to make. Again, it does not justify at all the murder of civilians and the terrorizing of what those poor people experienced in southern Israel. My heart breaks for them. And but my heart also breaks for what the Gazans have gone through. And so one of the points that I feel like I've been trying to say over and over again on my social media and to anyone who will listen ever since I started going to Israel and Palestine is, even if you only care about Israelis, which I hope, God forbid, that would be the only people, if you only took that position, but I know Christians who sort of take that position. Mm-hmm. Even if that is your only position, you want Jews to be safe and you really don't care about Palestinians at all. Well, shame on you for thinking that way, but okay. You need to still work for justice and for freedom and for equality for Palestinians. Otherwise, the Israelis are not going to be safe. I've been saying this, and I'm late to the game. There have been people who've been saying this for decades. Israeli peace activists, Palestinians, other international advocates have been saying this over and over again. And it feels sometimes like we've just been screaming into the void because people have just kind of ignored that. And now we're seeing how unsafe Israelis are. Maybe I should add something that one of my Israeli friends said the other day, which I thought was really powerful too. And I want to address this because the Israeli trauma is also real. And it's something that we need to pray about and do what we can to help alleviate this fear and this trauma. But Alana said that the Israelis carry two deep fears. One is the fear of the lack of safety. When you are not a citizen of your own state, you are a minority in some other state. What happens to you as Jews? Well, their history shows you are bullied, you are killed, you are kicked out, you are scapegoated, culminating with the Shoah. So there's that fear that this could happen to us again as a people. I'm speaking as how Jews say. The second fear, Alana said, is the fear of the colonist, the colonialist, the one who, she said, our history as Jews, we have a deep history in this land that's undeniable. Like, we have a legitimate right to live here. This is part of our history and our culture. But it's also true that the establishment of our state was inextricably tied up with European colonialism, and it was. And when we came back into the land, especially speaking of European Jews, we began to behave like colonialists. So we also have the fear of the uprising of the savages or the natives who we are trying to suppress and keep down. And that's also a very real fear. And she said on October 7th, both of those fears were fully realized for Israelis simultaneously. And then she said, and there's also a third fear, which, and I have heard some of my friends voice this when I was in Israel this spring, but we could get kicked out of this land again. God may remove us from this land again because we are not living as he called us to live in this land. And so there's this fear of like a third expulsion from the land. So
how do you respond to that third thing? What do you think about that?
I think it could be a possibility. Again, I would say if you hold the theological position that Jews should be living in the land according to covenantal obligations, which are outlined in Deuteronomy. And if not, God says, the land will basically vomit you out, just as it vomited out those who were before you. If that is your paradigm, I think that is something that you should be concerned with.
Yeah. And
I heard even some of my Israeli friends who aren't even necessarily that observant, but they were noticing this pattern when it, before October 7th, when the Israelis have been just at each other's throat this year, people in the streets calling for civil war. I saw it and heard it with my own eyes. I saw the way that they were insulting each other and just ready to like tear each other apart over this very wide ideological divide that's in the land. And I heard some of my friends' voice. Yeah, we're also kind of afraid. We've been a state now for 70 years, and who knows if we'll make it much longer. So I do think that is a valid fear.
How intertwined is the faith of the Jewish people versus the state of Israel, because I think it's important for us to remember that they're not one and the same thing. I don't think. I mean, the politicians, the leaders are going to behave in one way, and they may not be motivated by their faith in Yahweh. You just brought us all the way back to Deuteronomy, but my guess is that those who are making decisions about Israeli defense, Israeli war policy, things like that, are probably not referencing the Torah that often.
No, I mean,
Right.
there's such diversity within Israeli thought, and that's another thing I wish that Westerners could understand, especially some of my brothers and sisters in Christ who sort of just paint Israel with one brush as though this is all. Many Israelis are not religious at all. Like, they don't believe in God. Many of them lost their faith after the Holocaust. And so they have this idea like, no one's going to fight for us. We will not survive. And certainly God's not going to help us. It's up to us now.
That's really helpful, Mercy, because I mean, I was in discussion with some friends on the weekend, and I, as a Christ follower, kind of kept on defaulting back to Christ's teachings. And my friend said, yeah, but these guys don't believe in Jesus. And then another friend piped up and said, well, they do believe in the God that Jesus came to reveal, which was a helpful response. But I think bringing it right back to covenant, to the original covenant, which we have written down, that's a really helpful place to default to.
Yeah, I think so too. And there are a lot of Jewish, I would call them prophetic voices, who are saying these things, and I hear some of my Jewish friends lamenting because they feel that the expression of Judaism is changing, like the Judaism that developed in diaspora, rabbinic Judaism, which was a Judaism of people who were like on the underside of power, and how do we as a minority community in exile stay faithful to the Lord? And there was a lot of emphasis on justice, especially with those who took even a broader view, like more socially progressive and standing with the oppressed, and so on. And that's the Judaism that a lot of my Jewish friends are very proud to be part of, that lineage and that history. But the Judaism that is now the Judaism that has a state and that has an army and that is in power, it's like Judaism is seeming to be in the process of reinventing itself, or at least in broad strokes, how many people understand it, that it's built around this state, Israel, and it's built around this military. So if I were Jewish, I would lament, just as I lament in Christianity, what happened to Christianity when it became part of empire, when Constantine converted, they say, and Christianity then became, instead of this countercultural voice from the underside of power, it then became in the position of power and then began to do all kinds of things. You have to begin to shift how you understand the moral and ethical teachings to oblige the desires of the state and empire that you are a part of. And I think that is what is also happening to Judaism in Israel. And I feel the lament of my Jewish brothers and sisters who lament that, because it is the same lament that I share as a Christian.
Wow. All right. Let me wrap up with this question. What do we do? You head up a network of evangelicals for the Middle East. So please, as evangelicals coming to you saying, what do we do? How are we to respond in these very, very dark days?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that question, because we just had a conference, as I said, entitled Crisis in the Holy Land. What can we do? And one of my friends, May Elise Cannon, who is, she leads Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a different organization, but she was at our NIMI conference, and she pointed out there's 5 types of advocacy that she's been pushing. And it was very, very helpful for us to hear this and to think about ways that we might engage. So the first is prayer and fasting. As Christians, prayer is not our last resort. Well, there's nothing else we can do. Let's pray. Prayer is what we should be doing first and foremost. We know that prayer is powerful, and prayer can change things. And fasting, I'm just going to throw that into, like, let's get radical. Pray and fast. Then there is social advocacy. Like, if you want to help change this conversation, use your voice and speak up in social situations, like write an op-ed to your local newspaper, or a letter to the editor, or share things, take some time to learn and share on social media in a public way.
Couple of resources you can share right off the bat. We got 2 interviews with Mercy Aiken. Let's share those.
Share those. Yeah. But there's lots of really good resources. Like, if you just want to understand what is going on in Israel, Palestine, from a human rights point of view, I would say look up the Amnesty International dossier that they put together on what they called apartheid in the occupied territories. And I know that word can be controversial. It can be quite offensive to people who consider themselves friends of Israel. But I'd say if you are a friend of Israel, at least see what is going on here so that you can be a good friend to Israel, rather than saying, they don't do that, they don't do that, they don't do that, I'm not going to give it the time of day. Because it's not just Amnesty International, it's Human Rights Watch. There's many other human rights organizations that just in the past 5 years have written very well documented pieces explaining in detail what is going on. I would really recommend people taking the time to educate themselves on that. There is also the Kairos document, which was put together by Palestinian Christians at least 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago at this point. And they outlined a lot of the struggles they face as Christians trying to remain rooted in the land. And they were basically on their hands and knees in front of the global church, 15 years ago, begging for help. So I would just say those are some of the places where you can start if you want to learn what is actually happening on the ground. Another point of advocacy, or something else you can do, is political advocacy. There are many letters that you can contact your Congress people. You can contact the White House. Jewish Voice for Peace has made it very, very easy to do so. You can go to their website and they have numerous petitions that are up there. Churches for Middle East Peace is another one that has made it easy to do so. But also taking the time to write a letter yourself and send it to your congressman or the president, or call them on the phone if you want to take it further than just sending a petition. And then there's economic advocacy, and that would be supporting organizations who are trying to make a difference in the land, like NIMI, like Churches for Middle East Peace, like Jewish Voice for Peace. There's numerous ones out there, and we really need to elevate the voices of people who have been dealing with these issues in very thoughtful ways, very compassionate ways, not hateful, in ways that are trying to do the best for all of the people living between the river and the sea, not just one group or the other, who refrain from using hateful language, who refrain from justifying the use of violence ever, who have been basically just working for equality for all of the people between the river and the sea. So support those organizations financially. So those are some of the points of advocacy of what people can do.
You mentioned social media, and I just get your opinion or any insight you might have. I know there's a lot of really, I hate to use this loaded term, but fake news, in terms of people are retweeting things that have nothing to do with the war. I heard that, people were sharing footage from a video game saying this is happening in the Middle East right now. How can people be careful to not share things that are false? Is it just a matter of slowing down and doing a bit more research before you hit resend or whatever?
I would say for sure that, because just since this war, or whatever you want to call it, began, there's been numerous things where wait, we have to fact check that. Wait, I don't know. There are still some issues where it's I personally don't know for sure, what happened in some of these more controversial things. And so I'm not stating it one way or the other. I think independent investigations need to happen. So I think people need to be a little slower in just immediately repeating the things that sound the most outrageous or egregious. Just wait a little bit on that. But there are plenty of things, I think, that are well documented. And especially if you go and expose yourself to some media outside of the United States, I think is helpful. And there are a lot of newspapers. I always follow different Israeli newspapers. I follow different Palestinian newspapers. I look at Al Jazeera. I look at the BBC or the Guardian. And also news sources that don't necessarily depend on advertiser dollars to bring you your news, because those people, those organizations, you know, often they can't say everything because such and such advertiser may drop them or whatever. So when I lived in Israel and Palestine, I would often like try to follow a story, like something would happen. And so I would read about it in the Palestinian paper, then I'd look at an Israeli paper, and then I'd look at a few more. And only when I did that, often could I put the whole thing together, like, oh, this happened, but this also happened. And this person said this, but they said it in this context. And this part also wasn't included in what they said, and so on. That's a lot of work.
Right? Yeah, you got to go and seek out a lot of different pieces of information, a lot of different angles to get the whole picture. Yeah,
not everyone can do that work. Let me give another plug for Churches for Middle East Peace, because my friend May Cannon is putting out really good, like succinct, kind of condensed news bites from every single day. And these are trusted, vetted sources that the organization as a whole has been examining from many sides. And it's often shared like on the more conservative end of what we know to be true. And she does these little videos. You can go to Churches for Middle East Peace and you will see these daily videos that May is putting out. And I find them useful. And so I would also recommend those as a source.
And how about you? How can people follow you, catch up with you, or keep hearing if they've been intrigued by what you're saying and want to hear more? Where do they go?
Well, they can always follow me on Facebook. I mean, I feel kind of dorky saying like Facebook is but Facebook is actually where me and all my dorkiness sort of
we're Gen X. It's okay.
have my largest following, and it's just sort of where I've settled through the years, and I don't have enough bandwidth to do a bunch of other like Twitter and all that. I don't really do. You can follow me on Facebook. You can also like and follow NIMI. You can sign up for our newsletter. That's nimi.network, Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East. We are going to be starting some prayer meetings. If you're interested in prayer advocacy, we're going to begin to have these twice a month, and you can join us on Zoom and we will just pray together.
I think that'll definitely intrigue some of our listeners. We got some awesome prayer warriors at Impact Nations. So
we would love to have you come and join us in prayer.
And Please. They can learn more about that stuff all at nimi.network. Is that right?
Yes. And some of this is just some of the stuff that came out from the retreat, but there's a little core group of us that's like, we're going to make these prayer meetings happen first of the month, probably also the 15th of the month for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. And there will be more shared. So just come and sign up for our newsletter at nimi.network, like and follow us on social media, and you will be able to stay up with all of these things.
Yeah. I should have mentioned at the beginning, but I think people have pieced it together. But you're no stranger to the region. You've spent quite a bit of time in Israel and Bethlehem and stuff like that. I know you've got a trip planned right now, tentatively for May. Impact Nations is going in November of next year, so a year from now. And I think we hold those plans loosely right now. We've been getting a few people asking, well, what's going to happen? I'm sure you're getting similar phone calls from folks who are planning to attend, but are suddenly worried. And I think we just don't know what the future holds. And so we hold these things loosely. But folks, I'm really glad that we had this opportunity. And if you didn't listen to that other episode, please go back and listen. I think this stuff is so valuable for each and every one of us. If nothing else, it teaches us how to pray, but I think it also helps us in our public discourse and the way that we're interacting with other believers, and helping us to operate with empathy, with charity and love. Mercy, thank you so much for giving your time once again to the Impact Nations family. You've really blessed us today.
Oh, I thank you so much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to share, and I hope it's helpful.
I think it's been very helpful. Folks, thanks for listening or watching to the Impact Nations podcast. Just a real quick plug for Impact Nations, by the way. We believe that the gospel is big enough and powerful enough to transform every part of life. And we're out there every single day in nations all over the world where people are suffering from indignity, from injustice. And we're introducing them to life in Christ, which means justice. It means setting things back to the way they ought to have been. And that means rescuing people from slavery, from bondage, and then setting them up to become long-term, to flourish long-term, to really discover that they were made in God's image and that they were made to have abundant life. And so if you want to join us in that, head to impactnations.com. Right now, actually, it's just about gift catalog season. And so you can check that out at impactnations.com/catalog and just read all the stories of all that God's been doing around the world through this amazing Impact Nations family, and learn how you can get involved. Thanks for listening to the Impact Nations podcast. Do subscribe. If you are a listener, you can subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Just look up Impact Nations podcast. I wish whatever it was 6-7 years ago, we'd come up with a better name, but there you go. We're stuck with this one. It's the Impact Nations podcast, a little on the nose perhaps, but and you can find us on YouTube, so you can see all the visuals. That's YouTube/@Impact Nations. And right now we are in the middle of season 8. And so you can go back and listen to all of those. They're in a playlist right there. And do be sure to catch that other interview with Mercy as well. Thanks so much for being with us this week. We're here every Thursday, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.
Thank you.